Every American I know who has spent time in Palestine comes back angry, disgusted, and traumatized. I've yet to meet someone who says it's not that bad. It's their fault and they deserve it. When I came back to the States and began processing everything, I couldn't turn on the lights or get myself out of bed for a week. What I saw was unimaginable. It was a cruelty aimed at a group of generous and warm people with a very, very clear intent to get rid of them. And I couldn't believe the group doing it to these people had done it to them not long ago. They took similar tactics and weaponized them against others. That is what I saw, and I can't unsee it. The children in the schools would stop me and beg me to come home and tell America to stop. They know it is us allowing this abuse. Myself and everyone I know comes back disgusted with Israel, and many of us weren't even in Gaza witnessing war. Everyday normal life for Palestinians is cruel, and it is 100% controlled by Israel. And despite what we've been spoon-fed our whole lives, it is not done because the Palestinians are violent and dangerous. It is done to rid the region of them, to make their lives so miserable they either leave or violently rise up, giving Israel an excuse to take more land. And the Israelis are not shy about this when you speak to them. Some might couch it with statements like, well, we tried peace, but they didn't accept it. It doesn't matter how they phrase it. They still end up in the same place, which is they can't stay and we want them gone. This tweet now has been seen, as I mentioned, millions of times. It has thousands of comments and retweets. And many people were able to share their own experiences when they went to the West Bank. And I want to share some of those with you now. Here's one, Myrna Schmidt. She says, I had this experience. As a Canadian, I went with a strong bias in favor of Israel. Seeing the truth on the ground changed my view 180 degrees in just hours. Here's another one from Stephanie Edmonds saying, my first ever international trip, Israel. That is what good Jews do. We learn our history and pass on the tradition. No amount of Israeli propaganda can undo what I saw and experienced during my time in the West Bank. Here's choices. I had the same experience after I went on a human rights delegation to Israel in the West Bank and Gaza in 1988. I so agree that you can't imagine it unless you've been there. Here's at Proverbial Soups. Sounds like my experience. Going to Israel, Palestine is the ultimate red pill. Nobody can gaslight Americans who've actually been there. We can't unsee what we have seen. Huma Yasin, I want to add, I have been well educated on the oppression of the Palestinian people. But when I visited the West Bank myself and experienced maybe a billionth of what they experience, my blood was boiling. I don't know how anyone with a beating heart wouldn't feel the same. Fallen to Woo says, when my sister visited in 2011, her group was stopped at a checkpoint due to a ruckus. It was Israeli children throwing bottles at elderly Palestinian women, and they couldn't do anything to help. Stukas Tom says, I've talked to Greeks. This is a person in Greece, says, I've talked to Greeks who went to Israel and Palestinian territories for religious purposes, and they said the living conditions of the Palestinians were terrible and degrading compared to that of what Israelis enjoyed. Mia shares a longer post I want to share with you. This is a really great story. She says, I don't know too many Americans who've spent time in Palestine, except for my father and my friend who went on a birthright trip to Israel and decided to see Palestine as well. Their description of it is no different than what's being described here. My father is a man who was shot 7 times in Vietnam, so it's not that easy to shock or horrify him. But he was pretty shocked and horrified by what he saw there. My father wanted to see the Holy Lands, but I grew up only a few minutes away from one of the biggest Palestinian communities in America, where he was a police officer for years. The people he met in that time also inspired his trip. He wanted to see for himself what they escaped. He was surprised at how many Christians were living there, and they were treated no different than the Muslims. He didn't say, "Oh, well, they elected an evil government, so they deserve this." Half of them are children, and there hasn't even been an election since 2006. My father loved Israel so much as your average boomer before he took that trip, but he came back with a much more balanced view of the situation and with a very heavy heart. As a person who's been to war, it doesn't give him some sort of sick pleasure to watch civilians die. He understands the complex situation with how Hamas runs things over there, but he also understands that the people who live in Gaza are oppressed. It's normal to have sympathy for the children who were killed in Israel and the children who are being killed in Palestine. Not too many people out there in the real world believe that one child deserves it and one doesn't. That sick, collective punishment is exactly what a terrorist believes in. Natalie Smolensky says, I visited Israel, Palestine in 2008, Tel Aviv, West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, Galilee, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and the West Bank city, Kwakilia. The country is breathtakingly beautiful, of immeasurable historic value. There are so many amazing people on all sides of this conflict living on this tiny strip of land, but the visit left me genuinely traumatized. There was no doubt that there had been a war going on for generations, which had hardened into a system of occupation and oppression. Sorry, I get emotional because I saw it with my own eyes, and it was horrible. We cannot be a government that supports this. We cannot be a people that supports this. We cannot. It is horrible what is happening over there. Of course the people rise up. Of course they fight back. We saw what happened during the pandemic. During the pandemic, Americans were locked into our homes, our comfy homes. We had DoorDash. We had the internet. We had a way to still communicate with one another. I mean, it wasn't that bad. It was bad, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't like we were totally oppressed. But the lockdowns in and of themselves, had Americans had to live through the lockdowns much longer. I mean, there are certain parts of this country that would have lived with them for a long time. We saw that. We saw that there were many parts of the country that were like, oh, whatever. And they're still wanting the lockdowns now. They're asking for them now. But there was a lot of areas of this country that absolutely would not have put up with those lockdowns any longer. Imagine lockdowns for years and decades. Imagine being oppressed to that level where the cops are roaming the streets with their guns, machine guns, not just pistols in their holsters, but just actual automatic rifles ready to go at any time. If you were to rise up and break out of your home, and you were to get your freedom, you want your freedom, you want out. And these guys are going to break you. Lots of Americans. I'm willing to bet that lots of Americans absolutely would have risen up. A lot of Americans would have broken out of their homes. A lot of Americans would have said, we're not putting up with this anymore. And I think militias would have formed. I think there would have been groups of people. We saw parents at just school board meetings rising up, angry, yelling, and they were called terrorists. They were classified as terrorists just for raising their voices, just for saying, I am not okay with this. And maybe they threw a punch or two. Maybe they got violent, and maybe they even got violent at the wrong people. But it was that desire for freedom. It was that anger of being trapped. It was the anger at what was happening to their children that caused them to rise up. So imagine that happening to you for decades on end, and even in a worse way, much harsher than lockdowns we could ever imagine. Of course, the people are going to create militias. Of course, they're going to rise up. Of course, they're going to form organizations and political parties and ideologies that are going to become extreme because they're in an extreme situation and they extremely want to get out of it.